Hi there, my name is Timothy Steains. I am part of Nikkei Australia, a group of academics, journalists, artists, interested people who look at Nikkei Australian history and identity. I'm also a lecturer in gender and cultural studies at the University of Sydney, and I'm Okinawan Australian. I'm wearing my Kariushi today. So I'm going to be talking to you about Nikkei Australian identity. But before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation to you from the land of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I also acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's such a great idea, the Tadaima virtual pilgrimage. It's very enviable that you do these kinds of things in the US. We're not quite as big as you guys, so it's nice to be part of that and to have, I guess, a sort of trans-Pacific conversation about Nikkei migration history, make sort of connections between us. I'm going to just share my little presentation here. Works. This is some of us here. This is us attending the Asian Australian Identities Conference. I'm also on the executive board of the Asian Australian Studies Research Network. I just think I thought I would just say that a lot of what I'm saying today is on the website, nikkeiaustralia.com. We also have a Facebook group, which you're welcome to follow. And some of the points I'm making about Nikkei Australian identity, I have put in a sort of academic piece of work, which you can see there, the PDF of which is on our website if you go to the resources tab. So I thought I would just flag that there. I'm not doing a very academic presentation today. So we'll be happy to hear. So I guess one of the first things to sort of say about Nikkei Australia is that the term Nikkei is slightly problematic in the sense that no one really uses that term here. And part of that is because the term Nikkei is associated with a sort of pre-war migration era. It's sort of, you know, sort of associated with poverty and a kind of wave of migration that not many people have connections to. That's because, well, while in Australia, like in the US, Japanese people were interned during the Second World War, we only had about 1,000 people, Japanese people of Japanese descent, living in Australia at the outbreak of World War II. Altogether, there were 4,000 Japanese interned in Australia, and this included people in sort of, like other areas of Oceania, including various other European colonies that had Japanese people. But unlike in the US, where a lot of Japanese Americans have that internment history as part of their family history, in Australia, only 141 people were allowed to stay. The rest were forcibly repatriated to Japan. Many of these people had made a life here, some of them lived most of their life here, had a family here, but they were still forced to go back. And so we only have a really small amount of people who are allowed to stay. And that means that the overwhelming majority of Japanese people in Australia are post-war migrants and have no connection to this particular internment history. In fact, a lot of Japanese Australian people don't even know about this history. It's not really taught much at school. And so I guess there's a slightly different cultural and political historical landscape for Nikkei Australian identity. In the US, where internment was a sort of marginalization experience that sort of galvanized the Japanese American communities in many ways, right? In Australia, because very few people actually have that history in their family, there hasn't really been an event like that has created that galvanizing sense of community or identity. So it's quite a different, there's quite a different cultural space, I guess, that we're talking about. And I would say that even there are probably very few people who actually use the term Japanese Australian, to be honest. A lot of people will identify as Japanese living in Australia, And I guess I'm talking about first generation migrants here. And when I say first generation migrant, we use this term slightly different to you. For us, first generation means the generation that migrated to Australia. So my mother, for example, she migrated to Australia in the 70s from Okinawa, and she would be a first generation migrant. I would be a second generation migrant. So there is a sort of a lot of the first generation people will identify as Japanese, and I'd say a lot of the second generation probably identify as Australian. And if they were pushed, maybe some would call themselves Japanese Australian, but it's not a term that's often used, and it's used even, Nikkei Australian is used even less to never. The other thing is that there isn't a really solid or kind of unified sense of Japanese community either. Yeah, there are pockets of it that are attached to particular kind of groups, maybe like corporate or professional kind of communities, or communities around schools or whatever they may be. Those are probably the ones, or religions, those are probably the ones that I have kind of seen or experienced. But there isn't really a unified voice or an organization or anything like that that really speaks for the community. We don't speak for the community as such. We're just a group of like-minded people. And so, yeah, so it's quite different. It's not as if we're fractured. It's just we haven't really come together in a really significant sense. And a part of that, I think, is because people don't really identify with Japanese Australianness as a kind of condition. With a lot of the first generation migrants don't really see it. They don't see themselves as Australian as such. So if the term Nikkei is not really used here, why are we using it is the other question. I guess part of the reason why we're using it is it's a sort of political gesture in a way. We want to see ourselves as part of a larger global migration history of Nikkei people. We're interested in creating those connections around the world, especially with, you guys and, other people around the world. And we also see ourselves as affected by and connected to this pre-war history of Japanese migration to Australia. We want to see ourselves as, on I guess a kind of, I was going to say spectrum, but what is the word that I'm, like a kind of trajectory, right, where we are connected to that history. We want to learn more about our current condition and what's possible now by looking at Japanese migration in the past. And I guess it's also a hope for creating a sense of grounded history in Australia, grounded Japanese history in Australia, and a sense of that kind of mixed identity of being Japanese and Australian rather than just being one or the other. So, yeah, so I thought that's kind of why we use this term Nikkei Australian. Okay, and because the community is quite disparate and sort of not really unified, I want to talk about the sort of multiple and heterogeneous forms of belonging. This is a bit of academic jargon, I guess. Jacqueline Lowe is one of the preeminent scholars in Asian Australian studies, because the Japanese community here looks like that. There are lots of different ways of being Japanese Australian or imagining what it means to be Japanese Australian. And part of what I want to do today is to give you a few different examples of how that can look like, how that can look. So I'll be looking at some people's experiences of Japanese Australianness and also some artworks by Japanese Australians that speaks to this sense of belonging, which can take lots of different forms. Okay, and this first clip that I'm going to play is from an interview that some of us did with Mary Nakashiba, who is a mixed-race Japanese Australian who was interned at the age of 14. She grew up in the sort of northern area of Australia, Darwin, which in the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century had quite a few Asian people. In fact, in some parts of history, Darwin had more people of color than it did have white people. So it was an interesting multicultural space to grow up in. And Mary Mary's mother is Northern European, his father was Japanese, and in this interview, this extract, she's talking about how she encountered the Japanese community in the internment camps, but didn't really identify with that community. And there's a sort of section where she's sort of saying that, you know, they used to fly the Japanese flag and sing the anthem and bow, and she didn't want to do. So I'm just going to play this little extract.
My mother was a Northern European, so in actual fact, my family didn't know anything about Japanese culture. My father used to take me down to the boats when they had mourning ceremonies for the dead divers and things, but there was actually no Japanese community as such, with just the three families, so we had no knowledge of Japanese culture. We grew up in Darwin, and like all of the Darwin kids, we were just simply Darwinites. So I didn't even know anything about the Japanese flag or their culture or anything. We had books about the legends and all of the myths, and I knew numerous Japanese nursery rhymes. We couldn't speak Japanese because my mother didn't speak Japanese. So for me to have to stand there, I didn't mind standing there and being counted, but to have to bow, and I think they sang, maybe it was a national anthem, I don't know, but we had to bow down, and I didn't want to do that. And this particular group of people that had succeeded Professor Inagaki were rather more militaristic than the previous ones, and they enforced bowing down. I know that I think that Lulu was the one who really objected. I can remember, I think it was one of the other girls saying that somebody slapped somebody's face. I don't know whether it was me, I don't think it was me. I hope it wasn't, because my mother wouldn't approve of that. But I felt isolated, and I also felt that I didn't feel a part of the Japanese community because I never had been. I was an Australian. And also, my mother was discriminated against. She definitely was.
Yeah, so I guess you can see there that Mary sort of talks about how she didn't identify with the Japanese community. I guess that the community that she's talking about was quite a conservative one, and she sees herself as more culturally Australian. She identifies with more her kind of like more her mother, a little bit more, who was white. And so I guess this is an example of a Japanese Australian identity where this internment experience was quite significant to her, and she wrote about it in her memoir called Beyond Borders. But her sort of Japaneseness is not necessarily about cultural Japaneseness. She sees herself as culturally Australian. But she was read in that way, marginalized for that reason, so it is part of her identity too. And I guess this experience was not an uncommon one at that time for second generation Japanese youths. This particular novel by Christine Piper, who is a mixed-race Japanese-Australian woman who's also part of the Nikkei Australia group, is partly about the internment of Japanese people from the perspective of the Hafu Japanese or second-generation Japanese that were interned. And excellent book, Vogel Award-winning book, and what some of the things that these Hafu youth experienced was, yeah, this sense of disconnection from the Japanese community there, and even a sense of antagonism with them, because the Hafu were quite loyal to Australia, quite patriotic, and saw themselves as Australian. And you know, some of them wanted to fight in the war for Australia, but were not allowed. There were other Japanese who were actually in the Australian military. They somehow managed to hide their background. But yeah, so they saw themselves as culturally Australian and distanced themselves from Japanese identity. And after the war, there was more of this distancing as well. They would have felt betrayed by their nation, but they would have felt stigma for being Japanese. Many of them that were allowed to stay changed their names, hid their identity, and so on and so forth, which is part of the reason why we don't have many of these, you know, third, fourth generation Japanese Australians who identify with their heritage in that way. So yeah, so there was that sort of period of stigma, and this is an example of someone who is descended from one of the people that was allowed to stay. This is on the top there, Andrew Hasegawa, who is part of our Nikkei Australia group, and he's written the story of his family on the website there. Below him there is Setsutaro Hasegawa, his great-grandfather. And here Andrew is musing about why he became interested in his Japanese heritage when many other people like him weren't. They were hiding it. He says, "My curiosity started at home as my father had gathered various items that had belonged to his grandfather, including a passport, pocket watch, abacus, and others. As a little boy, I can remember him showing me these family treasures and talking about his grandfather. It left an impression on me, and along the way I became more and more curious." And Andrew talks about how there was a shift in perception of Japan in the 70s and 80s. I guess we're talking about the economic boom of Japan. They became a trading partner, and people started becoming more interested in Japanese culture. We started to see Japanese restaurants. And so for his generation and later, there is less of that kind of stigma that and racism that people of his great grandfather's generation experienced. So yeah, Andrew has experienced this kind of shift in perception and a different experience of being Japanese Australian. And I guess this relates to some work that Christine Piper, who I mentioned earlier, had written the book After Darkness, some work that she's done with this kind of survey of young Nikkei Australian people for the Nippon Foundation. And some of the findings included young Japanese Australians saying that they hadn't really experienced racism or discrimination. That was not really a big part of their experience growing up. But we also have to remember that these were inner city kids as well. You may know, you may not know, Sydney is quite an Asian city. There's a significant amount of Asian migration to Sydney. And there are many schools, some of them more kind of like high-end schools or sort of academically performing schools where 90% of the students are Asian. And so their high school experience, they wouldn't have been kind of a minority or marginalized as such. They would have felt a part of the community there. And so there's shifting experiences of what it means to be part of the Australian community. My experiences were different, slightly different generation, and I went to a school in the outer of Sydney, so I was quite one of very few amount of Asian people. But the inner city Sydney kids can have a very different experience. But there was this sort of disconnect between the first and second generation Australians, right? So some of the second generation young people didn't really identify with the first generation community. This could have been sometimes it was a language issue, right? They felt excluded because of a lack of, Japanese proficiency, for example, or perhaps a less interest in a particular versions of Japanese culture. There wasn't many spaces for second generation people to get together, talk about their experiences, and share in a sense of community. There's a little bit more of this happening, I guess, online. You may have heard of Subtle Asian Traits, which is a Facebook group where young people post memes and post about their experience of growing up in Australia as Asian. It started with some Australian high school students and became a global phenomenon. I think the majority of the members are now North American. But that kind of open sort of discourse, mainstream discourse about growing up Asian in Australia wasn't happening in that way when I was growing up. And so there's a lot more, I guess, sort of pride or identification with Asian Australianness because of groups like that. So I anticipate and I expect that that's happening, that it's affecting young Japanese Australian people now, where they feel more comfortable identifying with their heritage and creating a sense of community around it. Okay. And the last thing that I wanted to sort of raise was this um, performance artwork by Mayu Kanamori and others, Jimmy Curran and Satsuki Odamura, where they went to various grave sites in the north of Australia and sort of around the Darwin Broome area, where there were some Japanese communities in the late 19th century, early 20th century, especially indentured laborers who worked in pearl diving, for example. They went to grave sites in these areas where there were Japanese people who were buried, and they wanted to pay their respects and offer kuyo to the spirits there, who Mayu believes are a part of the landscape. They're buried there and they're part of the landscape. And it's about this performance is in essence about Japanese belonging to place, to the land of Australia. I'm just going to play a little excerpt from this.
By the time we arrived on Thursday Island, we began calling our performances a ceremony with music and dance. We invited the audience to quietly explore the cemetery grounds. We gave them incense to place by the graves and water to pour over the graves, as it is done in Japan, to mark the simple fact that the spirits get thirsty too.
Repose is a project that looks at the notion that when you die, you become part of the landscape. The very land we walk upon is made up of our ancestors. And we're here tonight to pay honour and respect to the Japanese ancestors that came here to the pearling industry many years ago.
Thank you.
There's a Japanese word called kuyo, which means ceremonial settling of the spirits. Tonight we're here to provide our own kuyo in a contemporary artistic response. The Japanese artists that you're going to see tonight, to their response to their ancestors being buried here, and their own choice that when they died, they have decided that they want to become part of this land in Australia and be buried here rather than return back to Japan.
I guess this project was inspired by Mayu thinking about her longevity in Australia, thinking about spending the rest of her life here, and in essence of being buried here, and contemplating what she calls hone no uzumeru kakugo, sort of the preparedness of burying your body somewhere, and it's a way of imagining the longevity of one's sense of belonging to place. The Yauru elder Doris Edgar, who you saw there offering Welcome to Country, had sort of said at the performance that they just recently discovered that they had Japanese heritage and that one of their ancestors was buried in the cemetery. But there's also a sort of tension here, because in a conversation with another Yawuru elder, Pat Dodson, quite a prominent sort of public figure, Pat Dodson had, although Mayu imagined the spirits staying on the Australian land and belonging to Australian place, Pat Dodson said that in his traditions, he would see the Japanese as returning to their origins, to Japan. He would see the spirits of the Japanese people returning to Japan rather than belonging on land in Australia. So there's a kind of tension here between different cultural understandings of belonging, spiritual senses of place here that are in tension. And I think it's a really interesting tension because it raises questions about Japanese and other migrant settler feelings of belonging to Australia, especially when that sense of belonging exists on the back of the theft of Aboriginal land by settler colonialists. Right? Japanese migrants, like other migrants, benefit from the theft of the land and the existence of an ongoing settler colonial state. So what does it mean for us to have a sense of belonging when there is this claim to land that has not yet been properly negotiated? There hasn't been an adequate reconciliation process in Australia. There hasn't been a treaty. The Aboriginal people are not even acknowledged in our constitution. So there are ongoing tensions here about the extent to which settlers, including migrant settlers, really belong to land. So I think this is a really interesting thing to consider. What are our responsibilities to Aboriginal sovereignty of the land? And in a sense, I guess this project asks the question of how do we negotiate between these different sense of belonging and different cultural understandings of relationships to land. And I think this is an ongoing negotiation that has to happen in various ways. And it is something that I guess I want to leave us with, something to contemplate, something to, how can we imagine going forward in that kind of conversation? So I hope that was informative. I've tried to give you a few different strands of the significance of Nikkei Australian identity, the particularities of it, and the different kinds of tensions there. And I hope that there were some similarities and differences that we can share between our experiences. We welcome you to engage us online in our Facebook group or on our website. We would love to have these conversations about global experiences of Nikkei history and what kinds of things we share and what kinds of connections we can make with each other. So thank you very much. All the best for everything. I hope that everybody is staying safe in this difficult time, but it's wonderful that we can connect online regardless. So thank you very much and all the best.